When I heard David Lazar was coming to BYU, I thought I knew who he was. But when I Googled him and found out he's been published in a long list of magazines and has written 9 books, including the collection After Montaigne, Contemporary Essays Cover the Essays, and the critical work Who's Afraid of Helen of Troy, and he has made the notable list of Best American Essays 8 times, unless my count is wrong, which includes the first essay he ever wrote for his first workshop class. And when I read about Hotel America, where he is the founding editor, and which has been recognized in Best American Essays almost every year since Lazar created Hotel America in 2002. And when I learned he is a series editor for 21st Century Essays with BYU's own Pat Madden, and that Lazar created graduate programs in nonfiction for both Ohio University and Columbia College, I realized none of this was familiar. I didn't know him. I began his latest work, I'll Be Your Mirror, and I was immediately struck by his mastery of the sentence. I was not surprised later to learn that he was first pursuing poetry in his doctoral program before switching paths and going on to receive the first PhD in creative nonfiction. There is a consciousness to Lazar's sentences that makes one stop and read them twice just to look at them closer. In I'll Be Your Mirror, Lazar has the no-nonsense voice of someone who cut his teeth on the subways and back alleys of Brooklyn. His essays are mixed with echoes of nostalgia for a time before cell phones and instant media, sprinkled with words that will have readers looking in the dictionary, but only if they want to, and hides a bibliography of best books and best music and best musicals, as if these titles are traces of himself he can't help but leave behind as he thinks, as he essays. Lazar is never simply confessional. He is always pushing, striving for the beyond, whether that is analyzing why he loves to sing or exploring the essay genre as the mythical monster Hydra, who regenerates every time someone announces it dead. At the end of his essay titled To the Reader, Sincerely, he says, "I'd love it if you thought you really knew me." And while I didn't know who he was, this is how I feel after finishing I'll Be Your Mirror and The Body of Brooklyn. I think I do know David Lazar. At least, I know, as Lazar calls it, the vaudevillian persona that he has left for me to find on the page. And as you hear from him today, back at BYU after a long absence, I hope you will come to know him as well.
Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be back at BYU. Thank you, Patrick Madden, for inviting me back here. I'm going to read you an essay and a half, something like that. To get started, though, I thought I'd read a prose poem. And this prose poem is called, if I can find it, is called The Last Time I Saw Paris, which is the name of a short story by Fitzgerald and also a lovely movie starring Elizabeth Taylor and Van Johnson. I thought my childhood was like the aftertaste of absinthe, though I had never tasted absinthe. My friend Christine took me to a cafe in Montparnasse where the waitress and I thought I was amusing. I said thank you instead of yes, which I do from time to time. 25 years ago on my birthday, I looked out the window and the radio said the Challenger fell. It rained like there was nothing doing, and I heated little bottles of sake. I wondered if there was any warning, a clicking sound, a shudder. I went to an empty pub near Chalk Farm and smoked in a corner. Paris, black and white and heavy snow, quieter than when my mother couldn't open the front door in Brooklyn because the drifts had locked us in. A Sunday in December, and I was the only person leaving tracks to placate the gargoyles. Nothing was open, or everything was open. How could I have known? Okay. I'm going to start with an essay about music, and it's about a kind of music called doo-wop. And the essay is called Lollipop is Mine. Let's see if I can find the right glasses for this. It's a true sign of age, fiddling with glasses. No, I think I'm going to go without glasses. I had an epiphany near the Carrier Corporation in Syracuse on a wicked cold day. I realize how inauspicious this sounds, but we take them where we can get them, right? And quite frankly, I'm more apt to trust mud puddle realizations than I am any grand information about the meaning of life that comes to me while gazing out at an Umbrian vista, drinking a glass of wine. Don't get me wrong, or alternately, get me wrong, which might in itself prove interesting. I'm not advocating dreariness or suggesting that the only way to know life in some authentic way is through, well, anything. I think that's the point. I'm too old for formulas. I'm just saying that disjunction at least has some innate friction in it that can make life interesting. Anyway, as I was saying, I was by the Carrier Corporation, and it was cold, as it is apt to be in Syracuse in the winter. I was there as a graduate student, over 30 years ago now, studying creative writing, with wonderful teachers like Ray Carver and Philip Booth, and my mentor in poetry, Hayden Carruth. I was working on my thesis, a long, fractured series of poetic, dramatic monologues linked by narrative, based on the life of the folk singer Phil Ochs. I think in some ways I was trying to write out my obsession with Phil Ochs, whose music I had been listening to over and over for years. I suffer from a kind of musical hyper-perseveration, and I'm apt to listen to and sing the same songs, not necessarily to the exclusion of others, but with an alarming regularity, repeatedly, for months or years. And it was the songs twinning with Phil Ochs' life and fate, his life as a protest singer and activist, then mournful autobiographical lyricist, then crazy street persona and sad washout, culminating with his suicide at his sister's house on Long Island in 1976 at the age of 36, that haunted me and kept me hooked into the world of his work. I remember where I was when I heard that he killed himself, in my library carrel at Bennington College, which tells you something. I remember where I was for the deaths of 4 other famous people: Nat King Cole, Adlai Stevenson, Fred Astaire, and John Lennon. Make of that what you will. Hayden Carruth, my professor, who was an extraordinary poet and critic of jazz, was curious about the music, so I'd sit in his office playing him tapes of Ochs singing, his early stuff, There But for Fortune or Santo Domingo, and his late semi-suicidal songs, The Scorpion Departs But Never Returns, or William Butler Yeats visits Lincoln Park and escapes unscathed. Hayden really liked him, as I recall, and he didn't like much. I know I started by telling you that I was going to write about an epiphany, and I will. And it actually is about music, but music of a different kind. But there's a reason I was listening to it, and that had much to do with Phil Ochs. I've always been pleased that I managed to see Ochs live twice, once when he organized the concert for Allende after Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1975. This was at the Felt Forum in New York, and Ochs had his famous reunion with Bob Dylan on stage, which was more like the two of them merely being on the same stage. For those of you, I imagine a rather significant portion of my readership, who are not up on the private vendettas of singers from the 60s. Supposedly, Dylan asked Ochs what he thought of a song, and Ochs said he didn't think much of it, and Dylan threw him out of his limousine. This around 1966. Some people thought Dylan wrote positively 4th Street about Ochs, but that never made much sense to me. I also saw Oakes in 1974 when he organized the War Is Over concert in Central Park. I remember mostly that Joan Baez and Paul Simon were there, and that there weren't as many people there as I would have thought. They sang Oakes' song, The War Is Over. Perhaps it's hard to get as many people to show up for a celebration of something finally ending, especially when it seemed to end with a whimper. I have to shift scenes here to California in 1978, when I looked like a more angelic Roger Daltrey or less kinky Friedman, and was going to graduate school. Though when I think back on it, I marvel that just a couple of years earlier, I was sleeping in my basement bedroom in Brooklyn. Those are wildly intense years, 15 to 21, I think, as our songs struggle out of the lower echelons. We go from having our lunches packed for us to, well, a whole lot of trouble and bliss. For some reason, in California, I started listening to doo-wop all the time. I started buying doo-wop albums, collections on Laurie, but also obscure stuff on Holiday and Crimson and Belltone. I still have these albums. Why did I start listening to doo-wop 15 years after its prime? And yikes, that doesn't sound like so much from this distance, when doo-wop seems like ancient history, and from the geographical remove of its birthplaces on the East Coast. It's amusing to wonder who I was, driving 3,000 miles by myself, listening to Ralph Vaughan Williams in Kansas at sunset, or Joni Mitchell as I was pitching through the Rockies, anxious to get myself to my new home, and the perception that on a new coast I would find all of these new contours of a new self. I wasn't entirely wrong. But to get back to music, I'm not exactly sure what, at that stage of my development, when I was branching out into all kinds of jazz and classical music, led me into an obsession with doo-wop, unless it was a subconscious association of it with my childhood in New York. I mean, Dion was practically a saint in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I have and had dim memories of guys riding around in cars when I was a tyke and throwing bits of the Belmonts and the Four Seasons out the windows on warm summer days and nights. I should have known it from the very start, and I'll tell the world all about it, girl. Doo-wop was primarily African American and Italian American in practice, maybe in Northern California, which seemed very white and suburban to me in the late 70s. I was needing a little neighborhood playing in the background. I started listening to doo-wop all the time, but I didn't really know it other than the obvious hits one would hear in passing from the radio stations, from oldies shows. And even most of these weren't songs that registered deeply in me. Oldies were so old in the 70s. Doo-wop in all its permutations made its way onto my playlist. The early groups like the Penguins, the great Italian-American groups like the Belmonts, the Mystics, and Randy and the Rainbows, and brilliant black groups like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, the Coasters, and the Platters. Lyrically, doo-wop generally captured a pretty primal, young experience, but then again, I was really young and reasonably primal myself, having found what felt like some kind of loophole to get myself away from the naked city and the naked self. I wanted to clothe myself in California in a cooler, more ironic persona. But that also meant I had developed an absolute need to hear the Marcells sing Blue Moon, the Rodgers and Hart standard I knew too well, and with Hoagie Carmichael's Heart and Soul, one of the templates for the kind of chord progression and standards revisionism that doo-wop would embody. One of the crucial elements of many doo-wop songs, this isn't the epiphany, is the division of lead between a classic tenor and a falsetto, or a falsetto and a bass, sometimes sung by the same singer, as in the case with Frankie Valli and Dion, or sometimes split between singers, as with the Del Vikings, a group that was integrated, important and unusual for the time, 1955. But I loved this division or split, as though the single voice weren't quite enough, so that the consciousness of the song needed to expand its sense of persona to have a more lyrical voice or a slightly gritty and lyrical sensibility, representing both sides of what is invariably a lover's sensibility. But there is a very practical sense in which a different mode of articulation needed to be available, a formal shift to emphasize intensification, which was represented by the falsetto. Writers sometimes do this with typography, shifting into italics, breaking prose with verse, etc. Doo-wop has its sillier side. Novelty songs like The Lion Sleeps Tonight by the Tokens, which is still fun to listen to, or Oh My Mother-in-Law by the Volumes, or Rubber Biscuit by the Chips. You don't have to look far. But doo-wop's attempt to sing something in a new way frequently still feels very fresh and charming. Before I stop my general disquisition on doo-wop, on this medium-length foray into a story of musical epiphany, I must mention Multi by the Barbarians. Frequently included in doo-wop anthologies, it's a late edition and represents some of the qualities of classic doo-wop, notably a spoken narrative, though it also points to garage music and the creeping British invasion. Doo-wop and the girl groups, which are an extension and development of doo-wop, really pushed spoken narrative as a motif in songs like Remember Walking in the Sand by the Shangri-Las, My Boyfriend's Back by the Angels, Leader of the Pack, also by the Shangri-Las, Do You Love Me by the Contours, and Little Darlin' by the Diamonds. I created a small cult around the song when I was a graduate student at Syracuse, always playing it at parties. The song begins with the nerdy-sounding voice of a man, sounding like Buddy Holly looks, accompanied by a melancholy harmonica. I remember the days when things were real bad for me. It was right after the accident, when I lost my hand. There's a great accident motif in doo-wop, a classic way for lovers to separate, except in Multi, the speaker has been separated from his hand. It turns out he's the drummer of the band. The song tells us that he was very depressed as the rest of the band's refrain keeps kicking in Multi, apparently the singer's name. Don't turn away, you got a baby, don't turn away, you got to keep on trying, don't turn away, don't turn away. The high point of the song, the turning point, the verse that makes the one-armed drummer decide to embrace the world and keep on living is, now there's just one thing that I need, not sympathy, and I don't want no pity, but a girl, a real girl, one that really loves me, and then I'll be the complete man. Hold on, I'm going to actually play this for you, this little bit.
Now there's just one thing that I need. Not sympathy, and I don't want no pity, but a girl, a real girl, one that really loves me. And then I'll be the complete man. So I'm going to tell you, right now, listen.
How can I tell you how much we loved the lyric, a real girl, and then I'll be the complete man? Poor Multi, how we laughed at your expense. We did say silent prayers that you were able to move on to a real girl, though we always thought you were a complete man, as much as that is a thing to be desired. Some absurdities can never be exhausted. Think of Spike Jones. I also have to say a word about I Love You by the Volumes, and this in fact might serve as a kind of introduction to the epiphany that you may have forgotten you're waiting for. I certainly haven't, though I worry that you're going to want a really good one, like that high note that Frankie Valli would pull out at the end of a song. I Love You is not a promising title for a song. My reason is, well, it's the shadow title for every song ever written. The lyrics to the song are beyond disposable. They could have been written in 2 minutes on a napkin, but they should have stayed there. Yet that's part of the song's power. The fact that the lead singer, the tenor, who sounds young and slightly rough around the edges, is trying to articulate his feelings. This is really one of my favorite lead vocals because he actually sounds like everyone's inner teenager trying to find the words. He really can't find words that are incredibly new. Your love is oh so heavenly, my darling, can't you see? Which is why he ends up repeating I love you over and over again, along with I need you. But he's a teenager in love, and the strength of his feeling, the yearning he sings with, lets us know that finding language for feeling is just so difficult. But we have the music of his singing and his attempt, which leads us to what is for me one of the, if not the, most ethereally beautiful moments in doo-wop and in pop music. After the second verse, the falsetto lead, with doo-wop reverb and echo, sings do-do-do-do-do. It's hard to summarize it. Ooh, which is haunting and ethereal, as though the singer had just entered a magical world, as though the voice had just become suddenly a kind of even mystical joy, followed by his tenor I love yous. It captures a joyous love rapture better than anything I know. I used it at my wedding. I guess that means I can't use it again, were I ever, that would be crass, alas. And I'm going to play that for you. That really should have been the epiphany, shouldn't it? But I'm going to return to Syracuse, which sounds like Plautus via Rodgers and Hart. I was driving by the plant of the Carrier Corporation in 1981, a couple of years after I had left California, left my golden sojourn with its doo-wop soundtrack. And here I was back east in the Rust Belt, driving by the plant of the largest company in town. I don't remember why. At the end of the day, with lots of men walking toward their cars, looking tired. But there was a marvelous cold, bright sunset coming on, this being middle fall, a kind of orange glow in the sky, silhouetting all these tired men. And I remember, I'm sure you've had moments like this, feeling a kind of sympathy for them. Feeling a kind of sympathy for them, though not sentimentally, precisely what Hazlitt called and claimed to have coined, disinterested, meaning not a lack of interest, but the absence of a personal or autobiographical stake or claim, but certainly not an absence of keen or astute interest in the nature of well-being of these people. Just the opposite. I felt an enormous, sharp sympathy that was merely human. It was at this moment that the station I had tuned in, an oldies station, started playing the song Lollipop by the Chordettes. Lollipop was written by Beverly Ross and Julius Dixon in 1957, auspiciously the year of my birth, though unconnected to it apparently, after Dixon's daughter had gotten a lollipop stuck in her hair, inspiring Dixon on a consonantal binge as she repeated the word over and over again, and Dixon wrote the melody on the spot. Ross and a neighbor boy recorded a demo of the song as Ronald and Ruby, and it charted, though not at the level of the white girl group the Chordettes would attain a year later. I actually quite like the early version of the song by Ronald and Ruby. It's more stripped down, a bit less varnished than the next year's mega hit. It has the slightly raw quality of some of my favorite doo-wop songs, but they only play the Chordettes version on the radio. The Chordettes weren't properly a doo-wop group, but the song they produced with Lollipop, complete with added-on and uncredited bass intoning da-dum-dum-dum, followed by the popping of a cheek, certainly sounds like doo-wop by any standards. Close echoey harmony, teen love, bass counterpoint to the sopranos, etc. Like I Love You, the song is mostly in the melody and the singing, since the lyrics, while amusing, aren't exactly Chekhovian in their complexity. Sweeter than candy on a stick, huckleberry, cherry, or lime. If you had a choice, he'd be your pick, but lollipop is mine. Lollipop, lollipop, oh lolly, lolly, lollipop, etc. I call him. But I told you. I suppose one can go as far as to say that the song is a precursor of bubblegum music, that much maligned phenomenon of the mid to late 60s to early 70s that substituted saccharin for sugar in the pop music of that era. Think Sugar Sugar by the Archies. However, Lollipop, and just barely mind you, still has the benefit of sounding actually teenaged, the yearning semi-authentic, and the young woman's harmonies blending in and out to create a soundscape that catches you by surprise with its intensity. The track has a heavy rhythm section, bass and drums, which provides a sense of contrast to the chorus sound of the women. And the women are layered in two tracks on the first refrain, both singing the lyrics and also singing wordlessly in harmony at the same time. The song ends with a cappella singing, so there's a lot going on in 2 minutes and 10 seconds, which is one of the things that lovers of pop music always embrace. So as I said at the top, I was driving by the Carrier Corporation on this fall afternoon and Lollipop came on the radio. The song introduced casually by claps at the beginning. I turned it up. When the girls hit the refrain, I tell you now unashamedly, I started weeping. I thought it was so ethereal, like I was Rip Van Winkle and had woken up to Claire de Lune. The sound felt new, and the effect was transporting. That's what mattered most. And the thought that came into my mind was that popular music was sacred music, that lollipop was just Ave Maria with a bandwidth. And that thought on that day thrilled me, that a bunch of teenage girls singing about lollipop were no different than the Tallis Scholars or the Anonymous Four or the Collegium Vocale Ghent, with groups of singers releasing Monteverdi's or Bach's madrigals or cantatas, their choral texts about God or wounded love to exquisite depth. That was my epiphany that afternoon 35 years ago, and that afternoon 35 years and several digressions ago. Since then, I've never made excuses for anything I loved listening to or watching, as long as it rose to the level of lollipop. Feel free to do the pops, by the way. I will. Terrible version. This is a redub version. It's terrible. You get the idea. It's been redubbed with heavy bass, but anyhow, that's that. I'd like to end. I'm just going to read you the first section of this other essay. And it's rather short. If I can find it. This essay is called 5 Autobiographical Fragments, or She May Have Been a Witch. The first section is called She May Have Been a Witch. I was playing outside my house in Brooklyn on a summer day under the big oak tree that seemed to symbolize time. It must have been there forever, and it must be there forever. It was so old and impossibly rooted, so fixed. A very old woman walked past me and looked at me with what I thought was evil power, the power to hold me or hurt me. She was dressed in tatters, hunched, stock-figured for nursery rhyme caricature, for a little boy or some little boys. To other little boys, she was probably the woman next door or Aunt Agnes. Of course, she may have been a witch. I thought she was a witch, but didn't want to think she was a witch. She walked down the street, and I felt transfixed by her power. She didn't turn around, but I said to myself, if she turns around when she gets to the corner and looks at me, she's a witch. She knows what I'm thinking. I had projected such extraordinary power onto her because she seemed so different from the world of my day or the day of my world. Or perhaps because I was terribly upset about something, a broken toy, a misdemeanor, a wayward thought that couldn't be corralled or corrected. And so I projected the trouble, the problem, the powerful feelings onto this hunched, beleaguered-looking figure who, after all, probably had cast a sidelong glance at me and thought painfully how rotten age was, how little respite from pain and responsibility as she trudged down the street, and still, after all these years, never any money. Of course, she may have been a witch. I stood in the middle of a square of concrete, and it felt as though I couldn't breathe. She was halfway, now 2/3 of the way down to the end of the next block, where she must cross the avenue, Avenue Z, the alphabetical Land's End, where she would cross the divide to, well, another series of marked streets, headed toward the ocean a few blocks down. Would she stop and turn and prove herself a witch? And if she did, what would that mean for me? What was I to do? She came to the curb and stopped, since the light was against her, as I felt everything was against me. I felt in my body a heaviness, as though I had lost control, as though I were a witness seeing out of a vessel I were occupying, rather than being that vessel, which I had been only moments earlier. And then, very slowly, as though foreordained, and moving with a desperately smooth and slow fluidity, she turned around. She stared at me from a block away, and then she turned back and walked on. I was doomed then. What I feared was what I foresaw, and that's just what happened. Even as a child, I realized it made no sense to tell an adult I had seen a witch and was drawn into her power. Though I did anyway, I was not much consoled. My instincts were correct for the second time in a day, once based on the irrational and evil forces of the world, and once based on logic and experience. I shivered my way through the coming months and have thought of her now for many decades, this old witch who not even the benign spirit of my timeless tree could protect me from. I still wait for her to do me harm. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them, or attempt to. Or not. Yes?
You're probably aware of Elizabeth Bishop's poem, Large Fat Picture, where she celebrates the artwork of a relative and loves it even though she knows it's kind of bad. It strikes me that your first essay does something sort of like that. I mean, I'm speaking in broad strokes, but it's probably not the greatest music of the 20th century. How does one write about things that we care about when the aesthetic value is probably not all that great? Just what sort of tips would you give to students to not tip into sentimentality?
Yeah, I mean, everything's relative, right? The things, I mean, it's up to us to defend. And when you're writing about art, it's up to us. It's up to you to make the case, right, for the value of the things you love aesthetically. So, in terms of its relative merits, though, I think I make the point though that that some of what I'm writing about here has great merit. I actually am a great defender of of popular art as being just as valuable as what we call high art, and so I actually don't make great distinctions between high art and popular art in terms of aesthetic value, but the point is you want to be able to make the case unashamedly and lucidly, for where the value is, and then you also want to concede what is not so great. But conceding what is not so great is also part of what bolsters your claim for what you think is quite good, right? So. I mean, it's all about making distinctions. One is, well, it's a question of whether or not you draw your reader into the sharing the experience. So one is telling the reader about something you experienced, and the other is reproducing that experience with the reader. And I mean, the reader can have an epiphanic experience in a text without the text being about an epiphany, right? On the other hand, you can talk about an epiphany in a way that's, fairly uninspiring, which is, I hope, not what I've done. Thank you very much.